She was born on May 3, 1898, in a wooden house in Kiev, in the Russian Empire, to a family that could not always afford to eat. She grew up in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, the daughter of a carpenter, selling newspapers on a street corner at age 10 to help pay for her own school books because her family could not cover the cost. By 1948, she had raised $50 million in 6 weeks from American donors to purchase the weapons that kept a 6-day-old country from being destroyed by 5 invading armies. By 1969, she was sitting in the Prime Minister's office of a sovereign nation she had helped create from nothing, the first and only woman in Israeli history to hold that office, the third female head of government in the history of the entire world. And by October 6, 1973, at 4 o'clock in the morning, she was sitting alone in that same office, reading an intelligence report telling her that Egypt and Syria were going to attack Israel in less than 10 hours, and that the fate of 3 million people was sitting on the desk in front of her. Golda Meir was born into a world that was trying to kill her simply for existing. Kiev in 1898 was a city inside the Pale of Settlement, the designated zone of the Russian Empire where Jewish people were legally required to live, a territory spanning approximately 1 million square kilometers across modern Ukraine, Poland, Belarus, and Lithuania. Pogroms, state-sanctioned mob attacks against Jewish communities, were a regular feature of life inside the Pale. When Golda was 3 years old, her father Moshe nailed wooden planks across the front door of their house in preparation for an anticipated pogrom attack. That image, her father boarding up the door while her mother pulled her children away from the windows, stayed with her for the rest of her life and appeared in her autobiography, published in 1975. In 1903, Moshe Mabovich emigrated to the United States alone to find work and save enough money to bring the rest of the family over. For 3 years, Golda, her mother Bloom, and her sisters Shana and Zipka survived in Kiev without him. In 1906, when Golda was 8 years old, the family boarded a ship and crossed the Atlantic to join Moshe in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Milwaukee in 1906 had a Jewish immigrant community of approximately 20,000 people concentrated in a neighborhood of wooden tenement houses on the city's north side. The Mabovich family settled there, and Moshe opened a small carpentry shop. They were poor by any measure that mattered. Golda was an exceptional student from the first day she entered the American school system. She learned English within months. By age 11, she had organized her first public fundraiser, gathering classmates together to raise money to pay for school books for students who could not afford them, standing in front of an audience of adults and delivering an improvised speech that collected enough money to cover the costs. Her older sister, Shana, had become a committed socialist Zionist activist, hosting political meetings in the family's small apartment, and Golda absorbed those conversations from the age of 10 onward. The argument being made in those meetings was precise and urgent. Jewish people would never be safe in any country that was not their own. The only solution was a Jewish homeland in Palestine. When Golda was 14, her parents attempted to solve the family's financial pressures by arranging her marriage to a man in his 30s. She refused. She packed a bag, climbed out of her bedroom window at night, and took a train to Denver, Colorado, where Shana was living. She spent 2 years in Denver, attending high school, working in a laundry, and deepening her political education inside Shayna's circle of labor Zionist activists. It was in Denver that she met Morris Meyerson, a quiet, artistic sign painter who loved classical music and poetry and had no interest in politics whatsoever. They fell in love. She agreed to marry him on one condition: they would emigrate to Palestine together. He agreed. She returned to Milwaukee at 16, completed her education at Milwaukee Normal School, and began teaching. On December 24, 1917, at age 19, she married Morris Meyerson in a small ceremony. The same year, the British government issued the Balfour Declaration, a formal statement of support for the establishment of a Jewish homeland in Palestine, then under Ottoman, and then British control. Golda read it and accelerated her planning. On May 23, 1921, Golda and Morris Meyerson boarded a ship in New York Harbor as part of a group of 20 labor Zionist pioneers bound for Palestine. She was 23 years old. She carried almost nothing. She was leaving behind a country that had given her family safety, education, and opportunity. She left anyway, because she had decided at age 10 in a Milwaukee classroom that the argument her sister's friends were making in that small apartment was correct. Jewish people needed a country of their own, and she intended to help build it. The ship carrying Golda and Morris Meyerson arrived at the port of Tel Aviv in July 1921, after a journey of approximately 6 weeks across the Atlantic and Mediterranean. Palestine in 1921 was a British Mandate territory of approximately 750,000 people, of whom approximately 83,000 were Jewish. The land was largely arid, infrastructure was minimal, and the political tension between Jewish settlers, Arab populations, and British authorities was already producing regular violence. Golda had known this before she boarded the ship. She came anyway. She and Morris applied to join Kibbutz Merhavia in the Jezreel Valley, a collective agricultural settlement where members shared all labor, all food, and all property equally. The kibbutz committee initially rejected her application. The reasons recorded in the kibbutz minutes were that American immigrants were considered too soft for the physical demands of collective agricultural life, and that a woman with a husband was seen as a liability rather than an asset. Golda appeared before the committee in person and argued her case directly until they reversed the decision. She spent the next 2 years waking before dawn to pick almonds, work the fields, and manage the kibbutz kitchen, and within 18 months she had been elected by her fellow kibbutz members as their delegate to the Histadrut, the General Federation of Jewish Labor in Palestine, the most powerful Jewish political institution in the territory. Morris hated kibbutz life. He was ill, unhappy, and temperamentally unsuited to the collective discipline the settlement demanded. In 1924, Golda made a painful compromise, and they left Merhavia to settle in Tel Aviv and then Jerusalem, where Morris could find work and recover his health. They had 2 children, Menachem born in 1924 and Sarah born in 1926. But the compromise extracted a permanent cost. Golda's political work with the Histadrut required constant travel, long absences, and total commitment. Morris wanted a conventional domestic life. She could not provide it, and she knew it. They separated in the mid-1930s, though they never formally divorced, and Morris Meyerson died in 1951. Golda carried the guilt of that separation publicly and privately for the rest of her life. Through the 1930s and 1940s, her rise through the Zionist political infrastructure was relentless. She became head of the political department of the Jewish Agency in 1946, effectively the foreign minister of a state that did not yet exist, negotiating with British authorities, American Jewish organizations, and United Nations representatives simultaneously. In January 1948, with the United Nations partition plan for Palestine already passed, and Arab armies publicly announcing their intention to invade the moment British forces withdrew, the Jewish Agency's military leadership told her they needed $25 to $30 million within weeks to purchase weapons, or the new state would not survive its first day. Golda Meir flew to the United States in January 1948 with no title, no government, and no state behind her. She had a borrowed coat and a prepared speech. She traveled to Chicago and stood before the General Assembly of the Council of Jewish Federations and told them precisely what was coming. She told them that within a few months a Jewish state would exist, whether the Arab armies attacked or not, and that the only question was whether it would survive. She asked for $25 to $30 million. She raised $50 million in 6 weeks, the equivalent of approximately $630 million in 2024 terms. David Ben-Gurion, who would become Israel's first prime minister, said afterward that the person who made the state possible was the Jewish woman who went to America and came back with the money. On May 14, 1948, at 4 p.m. in Tel Aviv, David Ben-Gurion read the Israeli Declaration of Independence before an audience of approximately 250 people in the Tel Aviv Museum of Art. Golda Meir was one of 37 signatories. She later said that when she put her pen to that document, she wept so hard she could barely see the paper. Within 24 hours, Egypt, Jordan, Syria, Iraq, and Lebanon had all declared war, and their combined forces crossed into Israeli territory simultaneously. The War of Independence lasted until July 1949. Israel survived. The following 20 years produced a biography of relentless public service that would have constituted a complete lifetime for anyone else. She served as Israel's ambassador to the Soviet Union from 1948 to 1949, watching 50,000 Soviet Jews risk arrest to gather in the streets of Moscow simply to see her walk by. She served as Minister of Labor from 1949 to 1956, overseeing the construction of 30,000 housing units and the absorption of 300,000 new immigrants into a country that was itself only months old. She served as Foreign Minister from 1956 to 1966, representing Israel across 4 continents and building the diplomatic relationships that kept a country of 2 million people politically viable in a hostile international environment. In 1956, at David Ben-Gurion's personal request, she Hebraized her surname from Meyerson to Meir, meaning one who illuminates. In Hebrew, on March 17, 1969, at the age of 70, Golda Meir was sworn in as Israel's 4th Prime Minister, the first and only woman to hold that office in Israeli history. She had come from a wooden house in Kiev with nothing. She had built herself and helped build a country. Across 7 decades of disciplined, costly, morally complex work, she was 70 years old and she was not finished. She had no idea that the hardest 4 years of her life were still in front of her. At 4 a.m. on October 6, 1973, Golda Meir received a phone call at her private residence in Jerusalem. The head of Israeli military intelligence, General Eli Zira, informed her that Egypt and Syria would launch a coordinated surprise attack against Israel later that same day. The attack was scheduled for 6 p.m. She had 14 hours. It was Yom Kippur, the holiest day in the Jewish calendar, the Day of Atonement, a day when Israeli radio goes silent, most of the country fasts, and the roads empty completely. She convened an emergency meeting of her senior military and political advisors at 8 a.m. Her military chief of staff, General David Elazar, requested authorization for a preemptive airstrike against Egyptian and Syrian positions before the attack could begin. Golda Meir refused. She refused because she understood that Israel's survival depended on American military support and that American support depended on Israel never appearing as the aggressor. She later said it was the hardest decision of her life. At 2 p.m. on October 6, 1973, Egyptian forces crossed the Suez Canal on a 160-kilometer front, and Syrian forces simultaneously attacked the Golan Heights with approximately 1,400 tanks against Israel's 177. The first 72 hours of the Yom Kippur War came closer to the destruction of Israel than any moment since the War of Independence in 1948. Syrian tank columns advanced to within 10 kilometers of the Sea of Galilee before being stopped. Egyptian forces shattered the Israeli defensive line along the Suez Canal in the first 6 hours of fighting. Israeli casualty rates in the opening days were catastrophic. On October 9, 1973, with Israeli ammunition reserves critically depleted, Golda Meir made an emergency telephone call to U.S. Secretary of State Henry Kissinger and told him that Israel needed an immediate American military airlift, or the country would not survive the week. President Richard Nixon authorized Operation Nickel Grass, an American military resupply operation that ultimately delivered 22,325 tons of military equipment to Israel across 567 flights over 32 days. Israel survived. The war ended on October 25, 1973, after 19 days of fighting that killed 2,656 Israeli soldiers, wounded approximately 7,250 more, and fundamentally altered the political landscape of the Middle East. But survival did not protect Golda Meir from what came next. The 𝙎ᴜ Commission, established to investigate the intelligence failures that had allowed the surprise attack to occur, delivered its preliminary report in April 1974. Public anger across Israel was overwhelming. On April 11, 1974, Golda Meir resigned as Prime Minister. She was 75 years old. She said simply that she could no longer carry the burden. She lived 4 more years in private, largely out of public life, writing, receiving visitors, and watching the country she had spent 50 years building continue without her. On December 8, 1978, Golda Meir died in Jerusalem of lymphoma, a disease she had been diagnosed with in 1963 and kept secret from the public and from most of her colleagues for 15 years while she ran a country. She was 80 years old. She had been born in a wooden house in Kiev to a family that boarded up its doors against the mob. She had crossed an ocean at age 8, climbed out of a bedroom window at 14, crossed another ocean at 23, raised $50 million with a borrowed coat and a prepared speech, signed a declaration that brought a nation into existence and held that nation together through the worst military crisis of its history. She never held power for its own sake. She held it because she had decided at age 10 in a Milwaukee classroom that someone had to, and she had not yet found anyone more willing to pay the price than herself. That willingness cost her a marriage, her health, and ultimately her reputation in the eyes of the country she had given everything to build. And she paid every part of that cost without once asking to be relieved of it.